Hello, Antwerp. As you said, this is my first time in Belgium. I have spoken at more Bitcoin conferences than I can count, but by far, this is the most beautiful venue that I have ever spoken in. So congratulations, great architecture. My title is a bit clickbait. As you will see, this is in fact an issue that is far more than just about Satoshi. But the reason why I'm talking about this today is because this is the future of Bitcoin. And the main thing that I wanted to convey to you is that Bitcoin is not just about you and me. It's not just about us, the early adopters who are using it today. Bitcoin is a project for our children and our children's children. If we want this to be the future of money, it needs to be something that lasts for many generations, and preferably as far in the future as we can imagine. And if we want that to be the case, we have to safeguard it, we have to protect it, we have to continue to improve and build upon what we already have. We cannot be complacent with the current state of Bitcoin. And as we will go into today, that means we need to look out not just to tomorrow, not just to next year, but to try to foresee potential problems that may occur decades in the future. So, what is Satoshi's stash? This is a chart called the Satoshi pattern. We won't go into all of the details, but essentially, this is believed to be, in the blue, the blocks that were mined by Satoshi Nakamoto in the first 2 years of Bitcoin. And this is basically a result of many unique identifying fingerprints. There are different aspects of these blocks that make them a non-standard miner, someone who was using Bitcoin mining software that was different than what was publicly available at the time. There are many different reasons why it is reasonable to believe that this may be Satoshi Nakamoto. And if that is the case, Satoshi Nakamoto may have mined somewhere around 1 million Bitcoin, a pretty decent stash. Once again, we won't go into all of the details, but public key cryptography is one of the fundamental aspects that helps secure Bitcoin. There are two different ways that you can use public key cryptography. One of them is you take your private key and you encrypt data, and it makes that data so that no one else can read the data without the private key to decrypt it. But Bitcoin does not actually encrypt anything. Bitcoin is completely out in the open. Rather, with Bitcoin, we use an aspect of public key cryptography that is for authentication, for proving that you own a private key. So when you create a Bitcoin address, you are creating a public key, and then you are making some transformations to it, putting it on the blockchain. Anyone can send you money, but only you can spend that money, and you do that by cryptographically signing a message with your private key that you then publish to the entire network. And the world can verify, yes, you own that money and you can spend it. Some more details here. The specifics aren't particularly interesting, except to note that with a pay-to-public key address, this is the type of address that was used in the very, very beginning of Bitcoin. The public part, when you are actually depositing money onto the blockchain, has the public key, as you see here, and then a check signature operation. The rest of what goes on under the hood, this is basically how Bitcoin's programming language works, how it evaluates and validates whether or not a transaction should be able to move money. Isn't necessary to fully understand. But then to the right, we see a more common address that started being used after a couple of years, and this is called pay-to-public key hash. The main difference here in the script pub key, it has some other operations, but basically, instead of putting the public key itself onto the blockchain, you put a hash of the public key. Then when you want to spend that money, you reveal the public key as a part of your spending script. Why is this difference important? We'll get to that. Shor's algorithm. We're definitely not going to go into the explanation for this. Don't ask me for the details because I am a terrible mathematician and an even worse cryptographer. But short version, this is an algorithm that allows a quantum computer to vastly simplify how difficult it is to find a private key. And you find a private key by trying to find the prime numbers that were used to create that private key. There's a lot of different logical circuitry and gates that go on here, and I don't even fully understand them myself. But the mathematicians and the experts are quite convinced, it has been proven, that Shor's algorithm would work if you had a quantum computer with sufficient computational power. So where are we going with all of this? Well, the National Institute of Standards and Technology is predicting that somewhere in the next 10 to 20 years, quantum computers will be able to perform Shor's algorithm. And once we have a quantum computer that is fast enough, what do you think people are going to do with it? Well, they're going to start cracking cryptography. And in particular, Bitcoin provides a very large financial bounty for anyone who can crack public key cryptography. So we would expect to start seeing some Bitcoin moving and being spent by people who had these quantum computers. So there's some other organizations out there who are basically saying, we need to start acting now. We need to start upgrading the way that we're doing cryptography so that we have this problem solved before it actually becomes a big problem. So there's somewhere around 1.7 million Bitcoin that are in those very early addresses, those pay-to-public key addresses. And because those public keys are already on the blockchain, if you had a quantum computer, you could start trying to crack open and finding the private keys to Satoshi's stash, to anyone else who was creating Bitcoin way back then and still left the money in those addresses. But it's actually worse than that. We actually have noted Belgian Bitcoin developer Pieter Wuille, possibly the most prolific Bitcoin developer of all time, who has discussed this problem a little bit. This was back in 2019, and Pieter basically said, there's probably 5 to 10 million Bitcoin that are at risk here. And the reason for that is because people are not following Bitcoin best practices. You should never reuse a Bitcoin address. Satoshi himself talked about not reusing Bitcoin addresses mostly from a privacy perspective. I don't think Satoshi ever talked about quantum computing threats, but reusing addresses actually comes into play for quantum computing attacks, because when you reuse the address, when you're spending from that address, even if it's a newer type of address, you're exposing that public key as soon as you spend the money. So you're essentially turning your quantum safe Bitcoin address into one that is no longer safe from an attacker. So what would we expect actually happen if a quantum computer of sufficient power came into existence? Well, I would expect they would look at the most valuable Bitcoin addresses that are on the blockchain. Most of these are going to be your large exchanges and custodians. If I was Binance or Bitfinex or Robinhood, I would be a little bit worried about this. I would start, as a quantum attacker, trying to go for that 248,000 Bitcoin. That would be a very good payday, even if I had spent millions and millions of dollars building that quantum computer. It would be, 100x payoff. But going even further, while we have mostly been talking about the risk of your addresses on the blockchain, there's an additional risk when you are transacting. Even if you are not reusing your addresses, as soon as you spend those funds, you're exposing the public key, it's going out onto the network, and if someone had a really, really fast quantum computer, they could potentially even crack that public key before your transaction got confirmed, and thus steal the money in flight. This would basically be considered a short-range attack. So if we're wanting to consider the entire spectrum of threats from quantum attackers, then you basically have to assume all Bitcoin in existence are potentially vulnerable to a quantum attacker with enough computational power. Now, this poses some challenges, and that's primarily due to the nature of Bitcoin itself. Unlike many other internet protocols, Bitcoin is a consensus mechanism. It is a very conservative protocol. No one controls it. You have to get people to voluntarily upgrade. From my own research of looking at Bitcoin node operators and how they upgrade their software, as of the most recent few years, it seems like a lot of Bitcoin node operators do not upgrade their software more than every 2 or 3 years. So we're talking very long time frames if you want to make changes to this protocol. And of course, most of what we're talking about is related to property rights. We say, not your keys, not your coins. Of course, the flip side of that is if you have the keys, then the coins should only be yours and not anyone else's. Quantum attacks could change that. It could break that rule of Bitcoin that we all find so valuable. Now, there's also problems with making changes to these rules. We don't want to lock people out of their own money. We don't want to make people's money unspendable. But also, we cannot expect people to be paying attention. We don't have a way to email everybody who uses Bitcoin and say, hey, we're going to make an upgrade to the protocol and you need to come along with us, otherwise you're in danger. And then, finally, we don't want the security of your existing coins to change. If you have Bitcoin in a certain security architecture, you should expect that your security should remain the same as long as you're not changing anything about your security architecture. But once again, quantum computers, if they come along, they could break that. So what are we fighting against here? It's the inevitable continued evolution of technological progress. We can see the charts. On the left-hand side here, this is, in case you can't see, it's a log scale. This is not linear. Each of these lines is an order of magnitude, 10 times more powerful than the one below it. So we can see that over the past decade or so, decade or two, quantum computers have gone from not existing and having basically no computational power to becoming close to 10,000 qubits. Now, I believe these are physical qubits, not logical qubits. Quantum computing itself and even measuring the power of a quantum computer is complicated. It's much more difficult than trying to explain a classic computer and the computational power. But the trend is clear. It's going up. We have no reason to believe that it's going to stop going up. And eventually, it will reach a breaking point. There's a project that one technical person in the Bitcoin community came up with a few years ago, which tried to take a number of these variables into account and try to give us some sort of time range estimate of how long we have before the quantum computing threat is going to be a big worry. I would say when you get to the point where there's 50% probability that a quantum computer could crack Bitcoin addresses, we should probably be worried. So this takes into account a number of variables that have to do with how to measure quantum computing, whether that's the number of qubits, which as we saw is going up pretty quickly. And then there's some related aspects to that, because a qubit is not always equal to 1 qubit. There's some error correction issues that need to be taken care of. There's some algorithmic efficiencies that can be improved. But whether you take a more optimistic or pessimistic assumption of what is going to happen with continuing to improve quantum computing, you can see somewhere between 12 to 25 years, and this was 5 years ago. So we're probably in the 10 to 20 year range now, where it would become close to 50% probability of a quantum computer with sufficient power to be able to crack into Bitcoin. So as I said, worst case scenario, we might need to migrate everybody to a quantum safe part of the protocol. And if we only needed to migrate Satoshi's coins, this would not be a big problem. Block space is limited. We have a few megabytes of space per block. But since there's only about 46,000 of those pay-to-public key UTXOs, we can do some calculations. We can figure out how much block space is required. And it would only take about 6 blocks. And this is a best case scenario, if everybody's working together and we can get the word out. And that's not a big deal. That's like an hour. But as I mentioned, unfortunately, it's not only Satoshi's coins. If we want to migrate all of Bitcoin, all of the UTXOs out there, we're talking 185 million UTXOs right now. If you look at the very, very bottom, there's a little green sliver. Those are those early Satoshi era coins that I was talking about at the beginning. Meanwhile, we have all of these other types of Bitcoin addresses, Bitcoin locking scripts. People are using a variety of different ways to secure their Bitcoin today because we have continued to upgrade the different locking scripts that are available. This is going to take a while. We can do the math. Breaking down all of these different, tens of millions of types of UTXOs, it's going to take several thousand blocks for any given type. And of course, there's a lot of assumptions that I put into these calculations, but suffice to say, this is a best case scenario. Bitcoin is not controlled by anyone. As I said, we cannot reach out and coordinate this type of thing. So this is only if everybody was suddenly trying to upgrade as quickly as possible. So at a very high level, best case scenario, to migrate all of Bitcoin is going to take at least 20,000 blocks, probably far more. So we're talking about half a year, best case scenario, if nobody else is trying to use Bitcoin for anything, which of course is an unrealistic expectation. So it could take years, and I think we should conservatively assume that it would take many years for this type of migration to occur. Can we do it? Well, there is a Bitcoin improvement proposal. A few months ago, a developer published this to the mailing list and said, hey, we could do this new type of address. We'll call it the pay-to quantum resistant hash address. Basically, make some tweaks to the current Taproot style addresses. But as with everything, there are trade-offs. For one, you can see there's a variety of different quantum resistant algorithms out there. And when we're getting into the realm of cryptography, using cryptographic algorithms that are only a year or a couple of years old is very scary. You prefer to use cryptography that has been around for 10 or 20 years because it's much more likely to be secure. No one has been able to break it. And the downside is these older, more likely to be secure quantum proof cryptographic algorithms are very inefficient. They require a lot more data. So once again, we have these trade-offs of how much data, how much block space is going to be required in order to do these migrations. Do we need more transaction throughput on Bitcoin if we want this migration to happen? Or, do we go a little bit riskier and say, okay, we want a more efficient algorithm, we'll use one of the newer ones. This is going to, I think, require a lot of discussion, a lot of people who are smarter than I am. As I said, I am not a cryptographer by any means, but this is why I think we need to start talking about it today rather than 10 years from now. So, what's the point of all of this? We know if we look out into the far future, there will be a point at which this becomes a crisis. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can foresee it coming. We can start discussing it today. We can understand that there are many trade-offs, and perhaps we do nothing. That is an option. I don't think it would be a very good option. But due to the nature of Bitcoin, even if we undertake all of these actions, there's no guarantee that we can save everyone because we simply do not have a way to reach out and make sure everyone knows about this problem. But the one thing that I think that we can be sure of is that if we do something or if we do nothing, some of these properties of the protocol are going to be violated. If we try to save as many people as possible, if we try to put in some rules that say you need to upgrade by the year 2040, we could still be at the point where people are going to get locked out of their money or have their money stolen from them. So this is going to be a controversial subject. And we might as well talk about it when it's not a crisis and emotions are not running high. So sooner is better than later. And as with everything in Bitcoin, it's all about discussion. That's really the best that we can do, is to try to understand what is the best course of action for the future of money. So we're very early on in the discussion of this particular problem, and it is by no means the biggest or the most pressing problem within Bitcoin. But I think it goes to show one of the reasons of why this is such an interesting space. I think we will never run out of interesting problems that we have to address, and because this is anarchy, this is a system of rules without any rulers, all we can really do is talk to each other and try to form consensus as best we can. So I look forward to talking with as many of you as possible about this and any other issues, because this is how we proceed together. Thank you. If we have any questions, I think we have a few minutes. I'm happy to discuss. Yeah. Yes. So, what would happen if a computer came online that started suddenly stealing people's money? So my suspicion, like I said, is that they would go after the highest value wallets. What are they going to do once they crack those wallets? It would probably massively move the market. What would you do if you suddenly had 200,000 Bitcoin? You might want to go buy a yacht and a villa. You might want to, start turning that into other assets. So I would expect that, yes, there would be a market-wide panic. And if people started to suspect that this was a quantum computer, and we had not deployed any type of quantum-resistant Bitcoin locking script, then everyone would rush to the exits. Would the market go to zero? Probably pretty close, if not zero. The most bullish people out there, I think Adam Back has said he's got his limit orders at 1 penny. Somebody would buy all the Bitcoin for next to nothing. But I think the vast majority of people would unfortunately lose a lot of the value that they had in their savings. And perhaps Bitcoin would recover. But who knows how long that would take. Because, like I said, even if that triggered a crisis response and we upgraded the protocol forcefully, it would, I think, still probably take years for the general market sentiment to recover and say, okay, we can continue on and go forward. So I think that is one of the considerations. Like, this is why we should want to fix it in a smooth as possible fashion before we get to a crisis. Yeah. Yeah, so what's a bigger threat, 51% attack or quantum computers? Definitely for the foreseeable future, taking over mining pools, especially considering that a lot of them are lying to us. A number of the mining pools out there are actually really run by the same group of people. I think mining pool centralization is a more today pressing problem. And from that perspective, that's why we should continue to push forward for something like Stratum v2. The nice thing about Stratum v2 is it really decentralizes the power. It pushes the power away from the mining pools and towards the actual miners, the hashers themselves, because it allows them to decide what does the block template look like. It makes it harder for a centralized pool to start manipulating things or even doing 51% attacks. So there's no shortage of problems in Bitcoin, and sometimes it can be overwhelming to even think about how do we prioritize the different problems out there. The only nice thing about 51% attack is it's probably a temporary attack, whereas a quantum attack, once we get past that threshold, it's pretty much game over until the protocol gets upgraded. All right. I think we're out of time. Thank you.